The 14th century was a huge time of change in Britain. The feudal system was starting to fall in decline, and there was a huge gulf between the few noblemen and the many peasants in the then two-tier class system. Another group slowly began to fill the gap, a class of merchants and craftsmen. The feudal system had no place for either of them. This new class lived rather like a colony of foreigners, tolerated and made use of, but always remaining separate. At the end of the 13th century, this trading class increased in number, and by the middle of the 14th century, towns were overcrowded and society was now more complicated. Change was inevitable, and the trades class was growing in wealth. The Black Death swept the country in 1348 and killed almost half the population, and this upset the balance of society, and many of the traditions and customs were abandoned. Society became more complex and no longer feudal, but commercial. People worked for a wage, and export took priority over producing food and clothing for themselves and their lord's household. What does the Black Death and the change in society have to do with art, though? Well, every big social change affects painting. When England was swept with a wave of Christianity, the art was gracious and serene. But now, in the worldly, greedy and ambitious society of the mid-14th century, these traits will naturally become reflected in the art produced. Why? Well, historically, those times when people of the genius fill the earth, poets, painters, architects, have been periods full of hope and enthusiasm. Hope and enthusiasm are the qualities needed for art to thrive. In every generation there are great artists, poets and musicians, as long as the world they are born into is great enough to nurture them. Without the nation infecting artists with their hopeful energy, they begin to swim against the tide, and no matter how great their skill, they achieve little. The change from the feudal system meant that it was easier for the ordinary person to become wealthy. They were now in charge of their own destiny. The day of the individual was dawning. People were thinking more for themselves and less of living their lives around how the church told them to. The church was losing its influence, but still remained the centre of activity, almost like community centres. Until this point, artists and painters had only been employed by either clergy or noblemen, but now with the rise of the trading class, merchants were growing in importance. Merchants were now commissioning work for the adornment of churches, which was previously considered the duty of noblemen. However, the merchants wanted to improve their standing in society, so took to making gifts of artworks to the churches. Obviously, they didn't do this just out of the goodness of their heart. They wanted to be seen doing so. Their motive was more for their own glory rather than the glory of God. The artists undertaking the work were aware of this and made the work more ostentatious and worldly. Although the artwork was still entirely religious, it lost a lot of the reverent quality it had previously possessed. Now consider the Wilton diptych. Although religious in context, this is treated as a court scene. It represents King Richard II with his three patron saints, St Edmund, St Edward the Confessor and St John the Baptist, adoring the Virgin Mary and Christ. Some would argue that this was the beginnings of art heading more worldly and less spiritual. The style didn't change much, but a different feeling began to creep in. The aim was to now give a complete three-dimensional look to a painted scene. It was no longer enough to convey a story. It was all about convincing the eyes as well as the mind. Painters tried to paint things as solid as they could as they look in real life. This great change of outlook and rebirth of art swept the world in the 15th century, known as the Renaissance. However, England was lagging behind in this respect. Just as being an island country had protected Britain from many invasions, like a moat around a castle, so it hindered the arrival of new ideas and thoughts. It is thought that many of the paintings produced in England at this time were produced by visiting foreign artists, including the Wilton diptych. Although we can't be certain, as back then, artists never signed their work. England hosted many visiting artists who were able to create in the styles of Europe, and who also began training British artists. the new ways of painting.